just begin by, we began this morning talking about globalization and world order in comparative perspective. And I think during the day we've looked at three quite dramatic changes in the world that governments are trying to govern, that firms are trying to operate in, and that civil society is trying to respond to. The first was about the winners and losers from globalization. We didn't spend probably quite enough time on what inclusive globalization might look like. It's been a theme for 15 years, and yet probably the biggest challenge in it is that all our ideas about inclusive globalization presume that most people in most countries will have jobs. And yet, if we look at the trend with technology and growth, we see it delivers less and less jobs. So what will inclusive globalization mean in an era where there are fewer jobs to go around? And what's the role of government in that? The second issue that we spent time on today was on digital governance. And for governments, I think the issue there is, what does liberty look like in the 21st century? We have citizens so willing to give every intimate detail of their lives to Google and Facebook and Amazon, and yet who leap with suspicion the minute they think that their government might look at or use that information. We talked about trust and the challenge facing politics and government as we know it, not just in emerging and fragile countries, but here at the heart of Europe and in the United States. As Dean of a School of Government, of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford, I'm often asked if we're preaching British democracy to the rest of the world. And my answer is always that actually we live in an era where every government has to be very humble about exactly what it's preaching, because democracy has deep fault lines and problems and challenges which none of us have yet delivered on. And then the third panel took us into the new geopolitics of resources and energy. And I think, again, we saw a very rich discussion of how that's feeding into the emerging powers and feeding into a power shift in the global economy. This panel this afternoon, to finish the day, is going to look at what international cooperation might look like to ensure that globalization changing in these ways can take place in a world which has as much order as it might have. We are not going to sit and redesign new international institutions. That would be a bit like a summer ago I watched a 16-year-old would-be pianist who didn't have the patience to learn his scales or to do his grade 2 piano exam, but wanted to throw himself at Rachmaninoff instead. So every time he realized it was too difficult, he shifted to a different Rachmaninoff piece and came up with equally atrocious results. And I think there is an attention deficit disorder of all those of us who look at global governance, whereby we ignore the fact that government is difficult and international cooperation that delivers is even more difficult. It's very easy to have a photo opportunity at a G8. It's very difficult to point to things that they've actually achieved. So to help us forge a new agenda for international cooperation, to help point us to what's actually already working, we have a wonderful panel, and I'd like to invite them up onto the stage now that the stage is ready for you, gentlemen. Yes, 2 of you are women and 2 of you are men. You can decide which. So let me start by turning to John Kufor, the former president of Ghana from 2001 to 2009. Because while you were in government, sir, your government really made great efforts to try to broker peace in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea-Bissau. And I'd wonder if you could share with us were there any international institutions or regional institutions that were actually helpful to that process? Or was it simply a frustration?
No, I believe there was a lot of help from the United Nations, also from the African Union, and of course, I was the chair of the ECOWAS, which was, in a way, an international institution. I didn't help simply as John Kufor from Ghana. I went in institutionally. And so it was a cooperative effort among these institutions I'm talking about.
But it didn't succeed in each country. In fact, in most it didn't.
We did, to a large extent.
Right, but in what concrete way did the United Nations help?
Sending peacekeeping troops, and also encouraging the other institutions, the African Union, ECOWAS, to play their roles.
And in what concrete ways did ECOWAS help?
ECOWAS assumed the lead role because if you take Liberia, for instance, it was a member of ECOWAS. And as I said, I was the chair, and we thought at the critical stage that we should move in to try to help the factions against the sitting government to negotiate peace. And there were many attempts at peace talks in Accra. The critical stage, the very critical stage, Mr. Taylor, who was, as you would remember, the president of Liberia, was brought to Accra into my office where presidents like Obasanjo and others from the region gathered, and we talked. We tried to prevail on him to accept that he might be the cause for the continuing conflict in his country, that for the good of the country he should agree to step down. And he agreed. That's where he decided to step down.
And when we look at the continent of Africa, 10 years ago, if we'd said, where does international cooperation affect the continent, we would have pointed to the IMF, the World Bank, and UN organizations. But today, rather rapidly, that's changed. The African Development Bank's lending much more than the World Bank. The IMF's very tied up in Europe. The African Union's increased in strength. There are sub-regional organizations. Is that right, that perception? Where do you think international or regional cooperation is working best on the continent?
Well, I would say that there's overlapping effort. There's strengthened cooperation from the World Bank, IMF, UN, African Development. All of us are moving together to try to help governments fashion the right policies of governance, and also to respect constitutions. So it's not like because the African Union is showing strength, we are abandoning partnership with the United Nations, for instance. No, the UN presence on the continent continues to be very effective. There's the Economic Commission for Africa, which is, in effect, UN. And there's hardly an event at the African Union where this commission is not present. So we are reinforcing each other to help Africa make its way.
And if you had to pick one issue on which you really wish that cooperation would make a leap, what would it be?
We are all talking development. And we want to open up the continent, full of resources, but somehow slow in breaking through, tapping into the natural resources that it has in abundance. So the African Union, for instance, prescribes a new partnership for Africa's development, meaning the partnerships should not only be locally generated, but also from outside the continent. So Africa can come by the capital, the know-how, and the markets to share in partnership fairly with the would-be partners. So we sort of quicken the pace of extracting the wealth to develop Africa, open itself up through, say, infrastructural development, energy, highways, airways, marine connections. All these are in the works. And also, like in agriculture, we've set up the CADEP. That's the Comprehensive Agricultural Development Program of Africa, to share knowledge of best practices, to catapult us on. And we talk of trying to leapfrog into the mainstream of globalization, because we see that we just do not have the option to stay out of the process of globalization. So we're talking partnerships, and it's all for development.
Thank you. It's a very positive view of both how corporations working and how it might work. I'd like to turn to Jan Eliasson. Jan, you described yourself as a man who's comfortable in the field, and anyone who's read your bio can see that you've been in the field in Nagorno-Karabakh, in the Balkans, Iran, Iraq, Darfur. This is a man that picks easy assignments. But now you're Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. And a former student of the Blavatnik School of Government, who's now in the government of a fragile state, came back to the school 2 weeks ago to speak in dismay about his meetings with a whole array of UN agencies who are supposed to be dealing with very specific issues in his country. And he pulled them together and said, okay, there's been all this money spent. Have you made any progress? And they said, oh, yes, we've made terrific progress. We've completed 5 reports. We've hosted 10 conferences. We managed to get a mention in the Secretary General's speech. We're hoping for a resolution in the General. And he said, no, hold on. Have you made any progress at all on the ground in my country? And I think international cooperation in much of the United Nations is measured in terms of meetings, speeches, reports, with very few outcomes. So here's my question to you. And I know you're dying to tell us all the good things the UN does, but here's my real question to you, though, because I think what we really want to know from you is, where do you think the United Nations is most likely to have impact in the next 5 years? On what major issue do you think it really will deliver impact?
Okay, but I can't refrain from starting with answering your first comment. I am a field person, and I know I'm the first one to say that we need to reform. And I'm a friend of the UN, but I'm certainly not an uncritical friend of the UN. We need to continue to work. But in terms of results on the ground, which I go out and check out every month or so in different parts of the world with this masochistic preference that you just mentioned. But I have a little card in my hand that I use when I sometimes at dinners meet with people who say, UN is helpless, hopeless and helpless. Here's just what we do every day, or these are the facts. We produce food to 90 million people every day in 73 countries. We vaccinate 58% of the world's children, saving 2.5 million lives a year. We assist 36 million refugees and people fleeing war, famine, or persecution. We keep peace with 120,000 peacekeepers in 16 operations, and we mobilize $12.4 billion in humanitarian assistance to help people affected by emergencies. So, I mean, this goes on every day out there. And I lose friends, I've lost colleagues in peacekeeping, I lost colleagues in humanitarian operations. And I just want to say that I feel tremendous respect for that, which doesn't mean that we have to work much better as one. Okay, what is it that we would hope to achieve practically? When I was President of the General Assembly, we devised a formula saying that there's no peace without development, and there's no development without peace, and none of the above without respect for human rights and rule of law. These are 3 pillars, and they are absolutely independent. And if I now say 3 things, I don't think they are pious hopes, but we are actually starting this work in these areas. You have, for the case of development, a tremendously ambitious work now on the successor to the MDGs, the 8 Millennium Development Goals. And I am pretty sure that they will contain solid work on, solid commitments on poverty reduction or even eradication.
Can I stop you for one moment?
Can I just finish? Yeah, because otherwise I'll lose my flow. And it will also have the element of sustainability. And then you need also to have the rule of law, the institutions to keep it up.
Okay, because I think
that's one of them.
These are important and good things, which everybody agrees with. But quite a lot of these things can and should be achieved by governments at the national level. So my question to you about these good things, I don't underestimate the important role of the UN and of global meetings in setting high aspirations for governments, but it's governments and below governments that deliver. So my question is, on all of these things, peace, development, and the rule of law and human rights, what's the collective action? What is it that governments cannot do on their own unless they go to the United Nations and unless they cooperate?
Well, there has to be a relationship between the different actors. I think we need generally in the world to think and act more horizontally and more and less vertically. This room here is a very good example of the kind of cooperation we need to have. To be here in London, a permanent member of the Security Council, strong bilateral diplomacy, discussing world order and globalization in the presence of governments, of international organizations, regional organizations, the private sector, media, civil society, academic world. That's the model for the future. We have to put the problem in the center. Well, that glass of water is a pretty good problem, by the way. Put that problem in the center and then ask ourselves, who can do something about it? This means that the United Nations is not the panacea. It's not, oh, you just solve all these problems. We are sometimes in the lead, and we accept that lead. But also we are very often a catalyst and trying to get others to act. And in some cases, even a sideshow to others. Put the problem in the center, ask who can solve them. I came to this conference because I thought it was fantastic that in London you have the chance to meet these people. You have spent this whole day on one issue, and you have very valuable time. And you have seen that here we have ideas from different sides. That's the kind of model we need to develop.
But a skeptic would say that's exactly what the United Nations does so well. It brings people together to talk. And that, yes, that's important, but surely there are some issues on which, if there isn't concrete cooperation, no individual country can achieve its goals.
Well, you stopped me from giving the 3 goals earlier. There is a discussion going on which relates to the most sensitive issue raised to Foreign Secretary Haig a while ago, namely what happens with the Security Council. He gave a pretty conservative forecast, 2045, wasn't it? So he has time, we have time to work on that. But there is an interesting discussion going on, and I know I'm entering sensitive territory myself, but the French came out with a proposal last fall of not using the veto in cases of mass atrocities. If we can go the direction without going through charter change, which takes for ages, but really realistically look at the veto and limit the use of the veto, and I think that debate already started. French are talking to the British and others, and maybe this will take on speed, especially if we see what we see every day, South Sudan, Central African Republic. That's a very grave issue, which goes on right now.
And
then the second thing that, so I finished my, you asked me 3 things. Yeah. Second thing is that we have discovered, it's not a sensational thing, that the first sign of a conflict erupting is very often human rights violations. Yeah. Well, if human rights violations is the first sign of something that could turn into mass atrocities, why don't we then do more about it? So we have now a program which called Rights Up Front, which is up there now. I've presented it to member states with the blessing of Secretary Ban Ki-moon. And we have relatively strong support for getting involved early on. Going to the Security Council, giving early warning about a conflict that can turn into mass atrocities. We will have fact-finding missions sent out. We will have quiet diplomacy. We will work under the radar to act early on so that we don't have to wait, as we did in the last minute, to South Sudan's atrocities in Central Africa. These are the three things. And it's not a pie in the sky.
No.
It's there, it's coming, and it's being done right now.
Just very, very briefly, what is it that the people in this room can do to make those three things happen?
Well, we will never be able to reach the goals of development if we don't have the mobilization of the actors that I've just mentioned. And by the way, to President Kufor, I would say this is really a great example of the UN Charter. One of the most underutilized chapters of the UN Charter is regional arrangements. I think in the future we need to mobilize this cooperation very actively, not only with the actors who are on this field, but also regional actors. And I'm so glad you gave a positive account. And I was also very glad the Foreign Secretary didn't only give doom and gloom on this. We are actually doing a lot which is not seen. But, you know, have you ever seen any, Nick Gowing would know, did you ever make a headline in the BBC on the disaster did not occur? It's hard, isn't it?
Good. Now, I'd like to move to Kevin. Okay, but I'd like to move to Kevin Rudd because I know he has a plane to catch quite soon. Kevin Rudd, as you all know, was Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 till 2010, and then again briefly in 2013. But your first step as Prime Minister, or one of the very first steps you made, was to sign the Kyoto Protocol and to announce a pathway for Australia to reduce its carbon emissions. So, in a way, I'd like to take you back to that moment and say, what did you imagine was going to be the international community's track? Did you imagine that this was going to be part of other countries doing the same thing, or that it would catalyse further action? And did you feel failed in a way by what happened at the international level after your quite bold moves?
Well, domestic politics is like global politics. It's the art of the possible. And we should never let the perfect get in the road of the good. So what did we do? One, climate change, as has been said here earlier today, is a global problem requiring a global solution. It is as simple and as complex as that in a single sentence. Two, if anyone chooses to opt out, if you are a developed country in particular, then you have absolutely created the preconditions for anyone else wanting to opt out as well. And if it's a country like Australia, which takes its global citizenship seriously, we didn't think that was tenable. And furthermore, when we did so, we then effectively isolated the United States, the only other standout country in terms of non-ratification at that time, which I thought was a good thing. Sorry about that, Nick. But it was good in terms of putting some of the acid on our friends and allies in the United States on this issue. Then, having ratified, that's one thing. What do you then do? This goes back to what you can do nationally, what you can do regionally, and what you can do through the UN. Nationally, we took the right measures, mandatory renewable energy target, got it through the Parliament eventually, price on carbon, got it through the Parliament eventually, massive conservative political campaigns against both, backed in large part by the Australian business community, the conservative campaigns, that is, not our action. Anyway, we knew we could not go to global negotiations unless we had ratified and acted, and then we did. In the lead up to Copenhagen, which was mentioned, I think, in the last panel from memory, we harnessed as much global political effort as we practically could. I was on teleconferences with the SG, Ban Ki-moon, every week, together with the then Prime Minister of Denmark and a bunch of others. We established the Cartagena Group, which actually tried to forge the consensus across a group of like-mindeds, both developed and developing countries. We got resolutions through the Commonwealth just on the eve of Copenhagen. We did all those things, and yet we failed at Copenhagen to produce a globally legally binding agreement for two simple reasons. China and India did not want to play. That's just the cold, hard, brutal politics of the green room discussion involving 18 heads of government, which I participated in for 2 days without much sleep. And so The practical question then is, what else could you do? I'm a passionate supporter of the UN system, not because I'm a romanticist. I'm very much in the Eliasson camp here. You know, it's like democracy. It's the worst system of government in the world except all the others. And the United Nations is the worst system of international government in the world except for all the others. And so our job is simply to maximise its utility, and that's what we're seeking to do. So rather than everyone around this conference and elsewhere saying Paris next year by definition will be a disaster, I actually suggest, and with the support of my great colleague and friend here from Ghana and others working on this project, is that the mindset of current political leaders, driven by an overwhelming consensus from the business community, should be, how do we turn Paris into a success? And I think global public opinion has shifted, and here's the key variable. The Chinese have also shifted. I can't say that of the new government of India. I don't know their posture or policy at all well. But the government of China has shifted. And therefore, is it possible through a bunch of like-mindeds, not necessarily exclusively through the agency of the Climate Change Conference itself, maybe with a plurality rather than an absolute unanimity of an outcome from Paris? But I believe we've now got the admixture to bring about an outcome.
But can I just ask you, so you're talking there about an outcome at the international level, but the outcome at the international level needs really solid foundations at the national level. And when we look at how quickly the government in Australia reversed your policies, do you think you took for granted Australia's support for them? Do you wish in a way that you'd built a more solid foundation of support for them nationally so that they would be less difficult to reverse?
Not at all. As I said, domestic politics, the art of the possible. We went to an election, we said we're going to act on climate change by putting in a mandatory renewable energy target, ratifying Kyoto and bringing in a price on carbon. We did A, B and C. I think it's fair to say, without being partisan, that we probably have one of the most conservative anti-climate change action governments of the world at present in office in Canberra. I don't think that's an overstatement. I think they would probably celebrate that view. And so the public were with us, but the public changed their mind at the last election. But to go back to your point earlier, to one of the other panellists, about what folks in the room can do, if you have a global business consensus on the need for this action, either by price on carbon, either by mandatory renewable energy targets, either by administrative measures or a carbon cap, and I welcome the statement by the United States in the last 24 hours and recent statements by the Chinese as well. And frankly, we can get there. International politics is the art of the possible. Too often at conferences like this, we exhaust ourselves defining the problem. I actually see great opportunities to land an outcome.
But do you, the broader question I was posing you, do you think there's a risk that leaders embark on international meetings and come to agreements which are too thin and don't resonate nationally? We live in an era now, as today's discussion has shown, of strongly nationalist politics, of citizens saying, we don't trust global governance. We don't trust our politicians much at all, and we certainly don't trust them when they're on foreign territory. So is there that risk? Do you think there's that risk that one becomes seduced by the G8 room or the G20 room or the UN room, and then you leave your population behind?
If the G8 and the G20 are vehicles for seduction, well, God, I don't know what your definition is. I mean, I've been to many more seductive places than that in my life. The bottom line is this. These are mechanisms which exist for a purpose, and the purpose is to deliver a global outcome, what we would call global public goods. Why is this one of the hardest nuts to crack? For the simple reason it is the largest market failure. And therefore, the immediacy of people's perception of the need to act is not totally immediately transparent. There are slices of evidence coming through, extreme weather events and extreme droughts and sea levels beginning to rise, etc., glaciers melting, but not enough into people's face to say, this is a catastrophe unfolding. And that is where you actually need some visionary national and global political leadership to say, we can see the future. It is bad. It is a market failure, therefore public policy must act, not just at a national level, but a global level, and we will go in this direction. And again, I go back to the point, national political leaders and international political leaders like Jan, we can go so far, but unless you have major constituencies in groups supporting you within your nations and not the international league of the most likely and anticipated support, namely the NGO community, but from business, recognising that this represents a fundamental assault on business certainty in the future as well, that is unmitigated climate change. Then, if you've got business marching together with national political leaders and the community sector, you'll bring about sustainable change. The alternative is just to disappear into a shell and say, well, we should take another 5 years to create a consensus and watch another half of Antarctica quietly float away.
Thank you, Kevin. I'd like to turn to Nick Burns. As one of America's most senior diplomats, you served across many continents. I noticed his first assignment as an intern was in Mauritania, a country which most students reliably cannot place on the map. I think our question to you is, where is it over the next 5 years that the United States is most going to want and need cooperation from others? We see the US go through isolationism, unilateralism, flirtations with multilateralism, etc. But if we come to the concrete thing, if you look 5 years ahead, where is the US really going to need cooperation?
Ngaire, thank you. And if I could at first just thank Chatham House for this conference and thank Robin for his leadership. I'm pleased to be here. President Obama, in a way, tried to answer your question last week in his much anticipated speech at the West Point commencement. He disappointed a lot of people because he spent most of that speech defining what the United States should not do in the world. And perhaps that was right to raise the bar to military action after the two big land wars. He set it very high. I think that was probably appropriate to set it high. But he didn't go so far as to say, what should American grand national strategy be post the two wars as we begin to think about leaving Afghanistan? And there's lots of things we can do. I'd cite three very quickly. Number one, we need to contain Russian power in Europe and help the Europeans through NATO and the European Union sustain European democracies and the Europe that, in the words of an internationalist American president, George H.W. Bush, preserve a Europe that's whole, free, and at peace. That was the mantra, the bumper sticker of Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand and Margaret Thatcher and John Major and George H.W. Bush. And Putin is challenging that. Second, we have an extraordinarily complicated and complex relationship with China. Kevin and I are colleagues at the Harvard Kennedy School. We've talked about this at length. The United States finds itself in the extraordinary position of looking at China and seeing our most important partner in the world on a host of transnational issues the next 30 or 40 years, and our most important competitor for power in Asia. And third, we've been laggards on climate change, the United States, and we need to get in the game. We need to cooperate under the leadership of the United Nations. And I think President Obama took a major step, and it's risky for him politically, with his announcement on coal yesterday. Can I say a word on each, and I won't take too much time? Lord Robertson of Port Ellen is seated here in the third row to my left. He led an effort as Secretary General of NATO when I served with him there a decade ago to try to convince the West European members of NATO that they had to strengthen their militaries. That warning, unfortunately, went unheeded, and now we find with Putin assaulting the post-Cold War security in Europe, we find weakness in Germany, barely spending above 1.1% of GDP, its GDP, on its national defense, when the NATO level is 2%. Of the 28 NATO countries, I believe 4 are over 2%. So Putin's given us an opportunity now to revive NATO, strengthen conventional defense in the western and eastern parts of NATO, and make sure that we can contain his power. And I agree with President Obama, Russian power is receding in the world, not increasing, so that we can protect all that Europe has gained. And I think you'll see at the Cardiff Summit major efforts made by many governments, Poland certainly, Norway, Denmark, to try to give much greater support to the Estonians and Latvians who are really on the front lines with their high ethnic Russian population. So reviving NATO, working with the EU is the first job. On the second, the United States has an alliance system in Asia built up over the last 65 years. It's very strong. It's going to strengthen. It's remarkable to go to Asia these days. Kevin, of course, is from that region and travels there a lot. But what I hear as an American is, don't leave. And you hear that from Malaysians, Indonesians, Indians in South Asia, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, which is ironic for an American to hear, please come back to Cam Ranh Bay, the Vietnamese will say. Because everyone understands they've got to work with China, trade with China. China is a big power and emerging. But China is bullying the Philippines in the Scarborough Shoals. And last week sank a Vietnamese fishing boat in the Paracel Islands. And I think unwisely contesting Japanese administration of the Senkaku Islands, the Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. China is really exerting itself, flexing its muscles, and while we all want to work with China, nobody wants to live in a Western Pacific where China holds sway. And so I think you'll see a strengthening of the alliance system. You're seeing it in the U.S.-Japan relationship, where the United States does support a new Abe commitment to collective defense. That was an issue that came up in the prior panel. You're certainly seeing it in the U.S.-Australia relationship. You're seeing it in the Korean Peninsula. Third, the last thing I'd just like to say on climate, it's so important that the Americans get this right. We are a fractured, divided polity, unfortunately, in our red-blue divide in Washington. And the president did not have the recourse to seek congressional approval to reduce carbon emissions by placing severe restrictions on our industry. So he chose to use executive orders. These are the orders that the president has to order one of his departments, in this case, the Environmental Protection Agency, to reduce coal emissions by a third over the next several decades. It's going to have a major impact on our coal industry if it's implemented. I hope it will be. I think the president's right about this. But it's going to be a big 2014 and 16 issue where many Republicans will oppose him and some Democrats from the big coal states. And we've got coal everywhere in the United States, from the western Rocky Mountain states right through Appalachia, from north to south. And I think he's showing a lot of political courage. And I think he's signaling, I'd say that his primary foreign policy objectives right now are to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon nuclear weapons power by diplomacy and negotiation, and join the global framework on climate by 2016. He mentioned that in the West Point speech, and I thought that was significant.
So on your first point, a world in which we're seeing the US and China not only as the two powers that have to cooperate to deal with the problems that we've been talking about at the global level, but also are each other's major competitors. So how does that look from the other parts of the world? So Kevin Rudd, how does that look specifically for Australia? Which way are you going to side?
Well, I think that's the wrong question, and I'm happy to answer it at the end of what I say.
No, I'm going to get you to just answer that one so that I can then get a view from Africa as well.
I'll answer it in a second. And that is that in the region, what you need to see is, firstly, on the Chinese side of the lens, and to give some credence to perceptions in Beijing, kept in a box for a long, long time. Foreigners, generally horrible. Someone mentioned this morning the outcome of the Versailles Peace Treaty, handing over German territories in China to Japan. And then you finally get to 1949. Then you finally go through modernisation post-78. And then you arrive in the 21st century. And China legitimately feels it now has a contribution to make to the world. Its internal perception and conclusion, which is important to describe, if not to agree with, is that it is now being contained. That is its internal conclusion and perception. In terms of our position in Australia...
I think encircled is the historical term.
They use the word 遏制, which is contained. And so when it comes to countries like Australia, we have said for a decade plus, and I can't claim any particular ingenuity in this, is that we are more than happy to walk and chew gum as far as China is concerned. We've been an ally of these guys over here, the United States, since we went over the top in the World War that we are just commemorating the centenary of for it's about 100 years. So that's not likely to change in the foreseeable future for a whole bunch of values and historical reasons. But in terms of dealing with rising China, we'll engage at all sorts of levels. And sometimes we'll have the most robust of agreements and sometimes the most robust of disagreements. And I've had both with the Chinese leadership. And I think that's the way in which we should proceed.
Thank you. President John Kufor, how does this look for countries in Africa? Some would say that this competition between the United States and China offers new opportunities. But others would say, as we move back to a world which is great power competition, it's small states that get sacrificed because they have to choose.
Fortunately, none of the great powers would come with pistol in hand at our heads to do their bidding. And Africa, perceived as the last frontier of development for mankind, is now being courted from all over the world. China is there, the United States, Europeans, Indians, everybody is coming to Africa. Why? Because Africa has perhaps an inordinate share of natural resources. They all want to tap. So they come. But Africa is rising, as we say on the continent. And we are aware that they are not coming just because they love Africa. And we do appreciate that we have to live in a world of partners. So the African Union has decided, and its main policy now, on partnership. There's a body under the African Union called the New Partnership for Africa's Development. And this is a call for partnership not only among the African countries, but also with comers from around the world. So anybody that would come and Africa would assess us, come with fair intentions to cooperate with us, to bring the know-how, which we lack in as of now, also the capital and the market, and would negotiate fairly with us on a win-win basis, we'll be engaged with, whether it's the United States, whether it's China, whether it's India. The main thing for us is to sharpen our negotiating skills. And on that basis, we believe we can cooperate with.
Thank you. So you've had a taster of 4 terrific views on where international cooperation is headed. They're quite different. They're not in disagreement, but they are different. They're shining lights on different parts of the world. I've got some specific respondents I'm going to turn to in a minute, but just before I turn to them, is there anyone in the audience with a very short, burning question? A question that you're really hoping a panelist will answer, but it's got to be really short. As you can see, I'm rude and brutal with anything long. Yes, Sir John Holmes.
John Holmes from the Dictionary Foundation. What's wrong with the G20?
Great. Perfect question. Free dessert for him. What's wrong with the G20? Just one sentence each? Yeah, Nick?
It's the right group. It doesn't have an executive arm that can be effective in the way that we need on the big transnational issues like proliferation or terrorism or climate. So that's why you see the proliferation of smaller groups issue by issue that the Foreign Secretary talked about.
So it's a legitimacy problem. Was there any other problem?
Well, it's a good group. They do a good job, but there are 172 other outside who want to have a voice also.
Yep. Good. Other burning questions? Philip Stevens.
Philip Stevens from the FT. 10 years ago, the Western view was that China would become a responsible stakeholder in the existing international system, and that Russia would realize that its interests lay in integrating with the West. For Nick Burns, what do you think of those views now?
Okay.
When Bob Zelek, then Deputy Secretary of State, used the term responsible stakeholder, I think it took the Chinese 2 or 3 weeks actually there wasn't a word for that or a phrase in Mandarin. They had to think about it. I think that China in many ways is a highly responsible global power. For instance, I don't think the United States ought to be threatened at all by Chinese investments in Africa or in Latin America. If we are unwilling or incapable of providing the capital and technology, if China can do it all and it helps African countries, all the power to them. I think they've been highly responsible on North Korea. In fact, we need China to contain Kim Jong-un. And I do think on issue after issue, because we can't be isolationists or unilateralists, we're going to have to grow very close to Beijing. On issue after issue, the divide will come with the Chinese on these big security issues that we've already talked about. All I can say in Russia is that President Putin, in his later age, is reverting back to his youth, where he was formed as a Cold Warrior. And it's a zero-sum mentality about his country's future in Europe. And I think it's been rejected, despite the fact that he's made this tactical gain in Crimea.
Are there any policymakers in the United States that are falling back to their youth as Cold Warriors in a response?
You know, I think President Obama, it's interesting, he's the first American president who didn't have a professional life during the Cold War. Graduated from Harvard Law School just at the end of the Cold War, and I really think he thinks differently, and I admire him for this. I think he perceives that while we have great power in the world, in absolute terms, we're still the most significant power, we can't get much done unless we rely on the UN or the G20 or bilateral relationships or smaller coalitions. And that, I think, is the way, that's the direction international politics is heading in.
And Kevin Rudd, we know you to be somebody who listens with a very knowledgeable and sympathetic ear to China. But are there any areas in which...
But not always sympathetic.
No, but are there any areas in which you think it is not being a responsible power as it steps up?
I don't think our friends in Beijing have quite thought through the implications of various actions in recent times in the East and South China Sea. Joe Nye, our colleague at Harvard, has a very good expression about this. And his expression is this: there's one country in the world that can contain China, and that's China itself. And that is, if you cause regional neighbours to become anxious about what you are doing, then the result will be, as Nick Burns has just described, as you roll around Southeast Asia and East Asia, that in fact regional states are asking the United States to stay. And I think the misperception in Beijing is the United States is somehow forcing regional countries to participate in some grand anti-Chinese conspiracy. That, I think, is a miscalculation.
Jan?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes there is a false dichotomy or a false borderline between national and international. If you look at today's issues, that borderline is certainly blurred and sometimes even disappeared. So I think I think I said this in passing this morning, we have to reach a stage where the international system has to work so well and produce such good solutions and formulas. And that's a big job and a big task, and we don't always do it. But we have to make sure that those international formulas are seen as being in the national interest. It is only when you, in today's world, on issues like climate change or migration and so forth, find that it is only by working out an international setup and structure which is serving the international interest, but that it is also basically something that your Congress, your Parliament, your editorial right to say, yes, this is our national in our national interest. That is, to me, the best conclusion of globalization in the present form. And we need we should welcome the fact that that borderline is off. You started with that, saying it has to be translated to national scene. Yes, there is no difference between the two. It is in the national interest to have good international solutions.
Right, I'd just like to call in a couple of people who we're lucky to have with us, along with all of you, of course, in the audience. But Shriti Vadera, where's Shriti? So Shriti, you dealt with cooperation both in dealing with the financial crisis and then in the G20, and then after government by advising other countries on the G20. Pretty frustrating in many ways, I'm sure. But let me ask you a very specific positive question as we wrap up the day, which is, if you had to make international cooperation work on a specific, in a specific area, what's the precedent you would use? Where have you seen international cooperation work at its best to deliver, not just to talk?
Unfortunately, I've seen it work best in moments of crisis, so you really don't want to repeat that. And it feels like the only time that it really works is when leaders can come together and see that actually it works for them individually to be working together. So at the G20, for example, in April 2009, there was this extraordinary environment where I'd never seen it repeated, never saw it before, where leaders actually, and Kevin was in the room, they actually spoke to each other. They didn't have a script. They didn't come with their national positions. They were listening and they were having a discussion. I think that we lost an opportunity which we will pay a huge price for in the deficit that remains in international economic cooperation. We've talked about the UN a lot, and there's a lot to criticize in the UN system, but we would actually reinvent it if it didn't exist. We don't really have a complete system of international economic cooperation. We have the Bretton Woods institutions, we have the WTO, we have the G20 with its deficits around legitimacy, but we don't have anything that works, however, ineffectively and efficiently. We just don't have a complete system. So actually the G20 had an opportunity to be both legitimate and effective, and we lost that. And one of the reasons was it wasn't given a secretariat, vetoed by the United States. And secondly, there was a principle that was discussed about creating its legitimacy in the participation of every single country in the world that participated in the IMF through a shareholder committee, so that G20 would become, in essence, the shareholder committee of the IMF. We lost that chance, again, because of some countries not, in fact, wanting it. So if you're taking Kevin's point about a market failure on climate change, or on banking regulation, or in economic, on balance surpluses and deficits, we do need that system. And I think the only way we can go back to it is by putting the G20 and the IMF together with something around trade as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, Sharita's reflections remind us that sometimes technical cooperation, such as after the economic crisis, can be easier than cooperation on conflict and war. And people have often thought that there's a spillover. If you get the economic cooperation right, as people thought prior to the First World War, you'll avoid conflict. Russia has integrated, but seemingly not, we haven't seen a removal of the threat of conflict. So, George Robertson, you're the former UK Defence Secretary, former Secretary General of NATO. It's been said that you argued 10 years ago that the West should strengthen militaries. What is it that you saw in Russia that made you think that the economic integration was not going to lead to interdependence and peace?
Well, it wasn't Russia that I saw that led me to advocate that the Europeans should do more. The first test of the Europeans when, as I predicted, the Americans would one day step back was Libya. And that is where the weakness of Europe, representing as it does a third of global GDP, exactly the same as the United States of America, found itself completely enfeebled. Italian aircraft carriers that had to go back because they'd run out of money. A British ship on its way to the breakers yard diverted. No aircraft carrier from the United Kingdom. That was the ultimate demonstration that you don't know what's going to come round the corner and what the surprises are going to be, and why you have to have robust military forces in order to back up your diplomacy.
So can I ask you, because you've been in government in Europe, why the blindness? All the panellists today, in fact, all the panellists throughout the day, have spoken of a world in which power is more contested, there's more likelihood of conflict over resources, over opportunities. So why have the Europeans not seen this coming?
Well, one of the things is that as the issues have gone global, the politics have gone local. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the United Kingdom today. In about 100 days' time, a decision will be taken by 4 million people resident in Scotland as to whether or not the United Kingdom actually exists after the end of September the 18th. A separatist movement is there, is very strong, it's got 30% of the vote at the present moment, and I don't think that the part of the United Kingdom down here in the south or the wider world has actually measured up what the consequences would be of the breakup of Britain, losing a third of its landmass, 10% of its GNP, 5 million of its population, and spending the next 3 or 4 years unpicking 300 years of integration in this union that is known as the United Kingdom. So we're not alone, because if Scotland actually breaks away, then Spain is going to splinter. Belgium is in great danger, and lots of other countries in Europe may well fall like dominoes as well. So that's one of the great ironies of the moment. What's the answer? The answer is leadership. It means that leaders in countries have got to focus on the truth, and that is that globalization affects people in their daily lives, for good or for ill. And I listened this morning to the guy who said that he'd helped to organize President Hollande's election victory on the doorstep and through social media, and what went wrong after that was, and he said, if I remember rightly, we lost the momentum. Well, you have to, if you're a politician, plenty of politicians here, and I remember Nick Burns as well when we were in NATO, getting sick and tired of repeating the same message over and over again. But you know on the doorstep, until you've repeated something on the doorstep, until you're sick and tired of it, that's when people actually pick up what you're saying.
Thank you.
It needs to be global leadership, it needs to be relentless, and that's the only way you'll reform international organizations and get attention to the problems and dangers that face us.
Great, and I'm going to come back to the panel in a moment, because it is, if it's not too rude of me to say, it's easy for former leaders to exhort leaders to take different actions. And we have 4 leaders on the stage, so I'm going to ask them not to tell us what other leaders should do, but to tell us, each of them, the one thing that in retrospect they realized they should have done but didn't, or could have done but didn't, so we can learn real lessons of leadership. But before that, just 2 other interventions. Jean-David Levitt is here. So Jean-David, we just heard a view of Europe. Why have the Europeans been blind to the external threat?
Simply because we were so absorbed by our own difficulties that we were focusing on surviving as the European Union, as the Eurozone, during all these years of financial difficulties. And if I may, I'd like to support what has been said so far. It's very easy to blame the international organizations, but the international organizations are us. And what is missing today, as Lord Robinson said, is leadership. The US is in a phase of relative disengagement. The EU is absorbed by its difficulties.
But can I focus you on that? You're saying that European leaders, and you were advisor to Monsieur Sarkozy, they focused on their own problems, but they didn't deliver there either. European citizens are voting in your own country for the Front National, here for UKIP. They don't believe their governments have delivered to them, let alone on the external threats.
Yes, well, on the external threat, and that's my point, I think what we need today is ad hoc groupings, because it will not be easy to reform the international organizations. And in the meantime, we need action. And action is for those who are ready to take action. And I had the privilege of serving with a president who decided, together with Prime Minister David Cameron, to help the Libyan people in a difficult moment. Of course, it was not perfect, but we managed to organize a coalition to help. And in this coalition, you had a number of European countries. We were backed by the US, and we had also 3 Arab countries with us. So that's a possibility, and I think that when the UN is stuck, paralyzed by a veto, when there is no possibility for other organizations to act, then it is legitimate, when it is absolutely necessary, to have ad hoc groupings taking the lead and trying their best to have these actions endorsed, of course, by the international organization, the UN Security Council, when it is not blocked by some vetoes and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
In this moment, I think that leadership, as Lord Robertson said, is absolutely necessary.
Thank you very much. Jorge Castañeda is here somewhere. Is he? Ah, voilà. Hello. Could I come to you on this issue of groupings? William Hague just told us that he finds himself in all these meetings creating new groupings to deal with each problem. And Jean-David Levitt has just said something similar with a positive vein on it. But Mexico, you know, your own country of which you've been Foreign Secretary, has made quite strong efforts to take part in formal international organizations. You've joined the OECD. You know, you've played an active role in international organizations. What's your view of the small groupings view? Does that push Mexico out? Are you comfortable with these informal groups, coalitions of the willing?
Well, it's better than nothing in the sense that if we can't reform the UN system, and if we can't reform really the World Bank or the IMF, then these regional groupings or ad hoc groups or the G20 are probably better than nothing. The problem I have with all of this, and it includes my own country, but certainly includes, since Mr. BRICS and Mr. Mint was here this morning, as he referred to himself, it includes the BRICS and the Mints. I'm not sure whether the world order that we would have if we reformed the Security Council, the IMF, the fund, etc., would be a better place in terms of human rights, in terms of non-proliferation, in terms of trade, in terms of the environment, in terms of climate change, with these countries like my own, like Brazil, like India, like China, etc., in all of these levels. I am not sure, as I wrote a couple of years ago, that they're ready for prime time. And I'm not sure what is a better human rights regime, the one we have with all of its imperfections, or one where countries like Brazil, like India, etc., would have veto power in addition to the Chinese and the Russians. I have my serious doubts. I'll stick with what we have.
Can I just check with what you're saying is what we have? Some would say it's a messy order where you've got regional initiatives, regional bodies, national bodies. It's messy, it's not integrated. And others would say one hierarchical order where the United States still plays key pivot position with the G7 elite sitting in first class, as it were, and everybody else in economy. Which of those orders is it that you're saying is the one?
It's not so much those two. It's a question of whether the other countries which were excluded from the foundational moment, obviously not China and Russia, but the others, Britain, India, etc., were to join all of the higher levels of the existing world order. What would happen on the fronts that at least I am attach most importance to? Human rights, non-proliferation, the environment, climate change, trade, etc. I'm not sure we would have a more functional, we would have a more representative world order. I'm not sure we would have a more functional world order, and I'm certainly not sure we would have, and that's of course a moral choice, a better world order. For example, on human rights, I'd like to know how would the Chinese address the issue of Uganda's gay repression law at the World Bank if they had the votes?
Because
I'm not so sure.
And how has Mexico addressed it?
We try and we make pretend as much as we can not to get involved. We're very good at that. Not as good as the Brazilians. They're better. But we do our best not to get involved.
Okay, great. I'd like to come back to the panel with this issue of leadership, which has been a refrain throughout the day. Not because we all wish that leaders would exhort more global governance, we're back to the beginning, but because there are clearly some things that in the last 2 decades leaders have not been doing that are essential in order to ensure that we get that minimum of international cooperation without which no country can do what it needs to do in these changing times. So I'd like just a brief reflection from each of you, as I said, particularly what it is that looking back, you now realize either you couldn't do or you wish you'd done, but were too constrained to do as a leader. So Kevin.
I wish that I'd won the election last year. Anyway, life's not always fair. But 2 things really hit me between the eyeballs, and they may be related to the first proposition. One is, in our Asian hemisphere, we made some steps forward in terms of building regional institutions. We got America and Russia into something called the East Asian Summit. The vision I've always had is how do you expand that into an Asia-Pacific unity, building on a European experience in the 50s where you decide that nationalism should not finally triumph, and with the carnage of 2 wars to prove it in Europe, do we have to have a war in Asia to prove it to ourselves? That's where that project was going. It is there in nascent form now, and it needs to be an institution which is capable at minimum of taking some of the roughest nationalist edges off what is a very, very sharp set of arrangements right now in Asia, which worries the hell out of me. And the second one is this. It's on the global front. G20 has come in for a lot of criticism. I'm one of its co-founders, I suppose, in terms of its existence at a global head of government institutional level. On the narrow financial agenda run by the Financial Stability Board and the series of banking reforms and financial institution reforms to deal with too big to fail and all the rest of it, frankly, absent it, pushing the FSB, pushing Basel, I'm not sure we'd got as far as we would have got to so far. On the narrow agenda, because it's not in the headlines every day, don't assume it hasn't had a useful effect. But on the broader agenda, and this is where I take the commentary from my British friend up the back there, who observed 20 quite seriously panicked heads of government staring each other across the dining room table at number 10 in March, April of 2009, thinking that we were at the Depression abyss point. That is, the whole thing was about to go over the cliff. And you do tend to look at each other's eyeballs and say, how do you feel about that? And the result was, and I pay enormous tribute to Gordon Brown's leadership, is that he actually pulled it together with several of the others participating, including ourselves, and that is where the crisis actually bottomed and turned around. But here's the point. To use that to bring together very scarce levels of global political capital to harness agreements about big challenges in the international system, which you can then, to go back to Jan Eliasson's job at the moment in the UN, you then put into the international system, which has, through the UN, unquestioned international legal legitimacy, but you've done, shall I say, 2/3 or 3/4 of the policy and political baking before it gets to that point.
Okay,
at present,
thank you.
200 states is sometimes a bit many to get that level of prep done.
Good. There's still a bottle of champagne for the one panelist who tells us what they wish they'd personally done differently. John Kufor,
Yes.
former president of Ghana.
Leader must have the following. A leader who, when he turns back, sees nobody is not a leader. And you must carry your people with you always. The world is undergoing very complex and traumatic experiences, which should call for think tanking all the time. For the leader to really stay on the ball and also to convince his people that he's taking them along in a visionary way. For such a leader to succeed, the people must trust him. Unfortunately, our constitutions tend to be so fashioned. A 4-year term in a developing world. What can you do with 4 years? And every politician wants to stay in office, like the Prime Minister just said. So we cut corners, and before we know, we mess up governance with our people. So sincere leadership with vision and information, well informed, backed by think tanks, and then telling the truth to the people. At the cost of perhaps they are kicking him out. If he tells the truth, they kick him out. Sooner than later, the people will turn around to see that the man was telling us the truth, and that would be the success of leadership. And this is where the world, I think, should be going, both domestically and internationally. The former president of Germany, Mr. Hoeskola, said that leaders should think globally and then act locally. And then we are looking at climate change, for instance. Scientists, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of scientists, reputable scientists, are virtually unanimous in saying man has contributed immensely to all the mess we are suffering now, and that it should be for man to rally to reduce the emissions, to save the situation. But the politicians are not coming at this issue well. They are not. Everybody is thinking of the next round of elections. And what time are we saving when we are being overwhelmed by the impact of the change? So I believe leadership, again, is the key to transformation, positive transformation.
And so both Prime Minister Rudd and President Kufor are telling us that leaders need more time in office. And I think there is a serious challenge there, which is that democracy as we know it is very short-termist. How do we deal with that problem? How do we ensure that we have governments that are stable enough to forge cooperation? Jan Eliasson, leadership, particularly perhaps a reflection on what you learned for your own leadership.
Yeah, but you asked us also about list our failures, didn't you? What we consider our failures, and I'll respond to that. I will admit 2 failures of prevention. I started as Deputy Secretary on the 1st of July 2012, soon 2 years. I came into the office and I read what Kofi Annan had achieved in Geneva on the 30th of June 2012, namely a commitment from all parties to that conference to establish a transitional governing body with full executive powers in Syria. And I said to myself, fantastic. This must be turned into a Security Council resolution. I was a lonely voice there, but I was just new boy on the block, so I didn't feel that maybe I'm wrong. Why isn't this instinctively what we need to do? And I admit now, why didn't I listen to my instinct much more clearly? We should have achieved a Security Council resolution on that formula in July 2012.
And what stopped you?
Well, I'm just admitting my sins here.
Yeah, no, I'm just very interested. No, because you're not, you're a bold man. So, what was the constraint? Did people treat you as though you were crazy?
We are, the Secretary and I are the servants of the member states.
Right.
We are civil servants, and the deciding body on peace and security is the Security Council members. So it's just my lack of persuasive powers vis-a-vis the P5 that I just admitted. Sure. Even more, now I'll go even further, it's really masochism here, pure case of masochism, is that I should have listened to a woman called Zainab Bangura, who came back from Central African Republic last summer and said, you've got to do something about the sexual violence against women. And by the way, Muslims and Christians are starting to hate each other. And this is getting very, very serious. And it took us until November last year to really have this cri de coeur, this sense of alarm. And then finally we got going. And I don't think I've ever delivered a more strong speech in the Security Council than I did. So Christian Anandbour asked me to interview. And I said, why didn't I do this last summer? Now, this was late warning. The French acted. We were in contact immediately. You sent 1,250. I called, can't you do more? Make it 1,600. And we did a lot of things. But I should have listened to Zainab Bangura, who saw what happened to women and saw what happened between Muslims and Christians back in those days.
Thank you.
But the most serious thing I want to say, I was inspired by Lord Robertson. I think we've been talking a lot today about the lack of trust. This is really what we are faced with now. We have a lack of trust in institutions. And these institutions are national governments in many cases. It's also European Union, I guess, United Nations. This leads to frustrations. And if the governments, if the institutions do not deliver, people will turn elsewhere. They will go back to primordial identities, belongings, like your religious faith, your sect, your ethnic identity. And that's when you start to get out on the slippery slope of everybody's equal value being questioned, and us and them, where the us is always finer and nicer than the them. So
Thank you.
That I think we should also recall.
Thank you. I'm aware we're totally out of time, Robin. But I'd like just, Nick, I'm sure you've got a gem just to leave us with on leadership.
I can't promise that, but I think George is right that leadership is a precious commodity, and with Jan as inspiration, I'll just say I was American ambassador to NATO at the outbreak of the Afghan and Iraq wars, and I wish in hindsight I'd had more prescience to see the terrible catastrophe that Iraq began. I wish I could have looked around corners with others in my government to have seen the value of restraint. And if we were founded as a school to honor President Kennedy, and at his climactic moment of his presidency, he exercised restraint with Khrushchev to pull back from the brink of a nuclear Armageddon during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that we, the United Nations, have struggled with this issue of intervention. We failed to intervene in Rwanda, terrible consequences. Bill Clinton said the greatest mistake of his presidency. We arrived too late in Bosnia, and Srebrenica had to shame us into acting. In fact, we came here to Lancaster House to draw a line in the sand after Srebrenica that we then responded when the Bosnian Serbs crossed it in late August of 1995, and see how we've struggled since. You know, you try to get intervention right in Afghanistan, in Iraq. We've failed to intervene in Syria with unbelievably catastrophic consequences for the 9 million refugees. We're not doing enough on Central African Republic, although France is doing a lot in Mali and CAR. And I just think this issue for all of us is a very important, of any nation, led by the United Nations, is an important one to get right and have the moral courage. And last point, Ngaire, it brings us back to my country. I deeply admire President Obama. And I think his instincts to be multilateral are right. But I also think, and here's the need for a sequel to West Point, he's pulled back on the throttle of American leadership too much. Maybe he's learned too well the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, because I think, as The Economist said, we might need more American leadership, not less, to make some of these institutions work. So that's an admonition for my country.
Thank you very much. So just two takeaways from this discussion, which I think has nicely brought some of the themes of the rest of the day together. But the first is what John Kufor reminded us of, that there were great hopes for global cooperation at the end of the Cold War that have been disappointed, but international cooperation through international organizations, as both John Kufor and Jan Eliasson highlighted, absolutely crucial. Just look at the continent of Africa, where there are so many collective action issues and problems, and you'll see why that's so necessary. And the second point is that alongside that, as Nick Burns and Kevin Rudd eloquently described, is a real new competition, and a competition that's going to rely on a lot better understanding, but also new methods of containment. And obviously, Europe's going to have to work out where it sits in that. And finally, I think the reflections on leadership are really important. And they're important not because we should be thinking, is this the personality? But also important because we should be thinking, do we have the political system to deliver the right person, the right structure for them to take the right decisions, and a long-term enough for them to take forward solutions to these problems? I'd now just like, on behalf of all of you and the panel, to thank Robin Niblett in particular, and Chatham House, obviously, Robin on behalf of Chatham House, and your partners in setting up this conference, but I'm sure you're going to do that. But I know Robin's going to take the podium, but let's give the panelists a huge round of applause, and Robin.